It was a Tuesday afternoon at a luxury mall, the kind of place where the air smells like expensive perfume and the marble floors shine under bright, designer lights. Danielle Thornton stood in front of a window display, looking at a pair of heels she had promised to buy herself the day she finished her nursing degree. For the first time in years, she felt like she could finally breathe. The shadow of her past felt miles away. But then, the reflection in the glass changed. Behind her beige coat, a dark, familiar hoodie appeared. It was Eric. The restraining order in Danielle's purse suddenly felt like nothing more than a scrap of paper. Before she could even scream, his arm was a vice around her neck, dragging her back into the nightmare she thought she had escaped. "You think you're better than me now, Danielle?" he hissed into her ear. His breath was hot, smelling of stale cigarettes and obsession. He wasn't just trying to hurt her, he was trying to reclaim her. Danielle clawed at his skin, her lungs burning for oxygen as he squeezed tighter. She looked around at the crowd, shoppers and families living their normal lives. But nobody moved. Instead of reaching out to help, they reached into their pockets. Dozens of people just stood there, holding up their phones, recording the struggle as if it were a scene from a movie. It was the terrifying realization that she was going to die while being live-streamed for a viral video. Then, he appeared. A man was standing 20 feet away near the fountain. He wore a black suit that cost more than a year of tuition, and he wasn't filming. He wasn't even shocked. He simply stood there with a cold, calculating expression, watching the scene like he was observing a minor inconvenience. Then, he did something that shifted the energy of the entire room. He didn't run, and he didn't shout. He reached up and began to slowly unbutton his tailored suit jacket, revealing the dark, intricate ink of tattoos crawling up his chest and neck. He moved with a terrifying calm, like a king deciding exactly how to dismantle a monster. Welcome to Underworld Love Chapters. Please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't, like, comment and tell us where you are watching from right now, because what this man did next was unthinkable. You need to see exactly how fast power shifts when the right person decides that enough is enough. The polished marble floor of the luxury mall was so clean it looked like a mirror, reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers and the calm, oblivious faces of the afternoon shoppers. Danielle Thornton stood in front of a window display, her fingers tracing the edge of her beige coat. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't scanning the exits or checking over her shoulder. She was thinking about the future, about the nursing degree that was finally within her reach and the life of peace she had fought so hard to build. But the peace didn't just break, it shattered. It started with a cold shiver down her spine, followed by a familiar, heavy reflection appearing in the glass. Before she could even process the dark hoodie or the twisted expression of the man behind her, Eric's arm was around her neck. The violence was instantaneous and suffocating. He dragged her backward, away from the light of the display and into the center of the walkway. "You think you're better than me now, Danielle?" Eric's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the ambient music of the mall. His grip tightened, his veins bulging with an unrestrained aggression that made Danielle's world begin to blur. She clawed at his arm, her heels scraping against the marble as she fought for a single inch of air. Then came the most terrifying part, the silence of the crowd. Danielle looked out through tear-filled eyes, expecting a hero, a security guard, or even just a voice to cry out. Instead, she saw a wall of people standing in a circle. They weren't moving to help, they were reaching into their pockets. Dozens of glowing phone screens rose into the air, their lenses focused on her struggle like she was a performance. She was dying in front of an audience, and they were more interested in the view count than her life. Just as the edges of her vision began to turn black, the atmosphere shifted. The frantic energy of the mall seemed to freeze. A man was standing 20 feet away near the marble fountain, watching the scene with a stillness that was more intimidating than Eric's rage. He wore a black suit that fit him like armor, and his gaze was locked onto Eric with a cold, predatory focus. This was Han Jae-sung. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. With a terrifyingly calm deliberation, he reached up and began to unbutton his suit jacket. As the fabric moved, it revealed the dark, intricate tattoos crawling up his chest and neck, symbols of a world far more dangerous than the one Eric lived in. Jae-sung's relaxed posture suggested he had already decided exactly how this would end. He stepped forward, his movements fluid and silent. When he reached them, he didn't even look at Danielle. He simply gripped Eric's wrist with a strength that sounded like a dry branch snapping. The unthinkable happened in a heartbeat. The man who had been a monster a second ago was suddenly gasping in pain, forced to his knees by a power he couldn't comprehend. Danielle stumbled back, her hand flying to her bruised throat, finally drawing in a ragged, burning breath as the king of the underworld stood over her fallen predator. The transition from the chaos of the mall to the interior of the black sedan was so jarringly silent that it felt like entering another dimension. Danielle sat pressed against the buttery leather of the back seat, her hand still trembling as it covered the angry red marks on her throat. Beside her, Han Jae-sung didn't offer empty comforts or frantic questions. He simply sat in the shadows, his presence a heavy, grounding force that made the world outside the tinted windows feel like a distant memory. The only sound was the low hum of the engine as the car glided through the city, cutting through traffic with a predatory ease that suggested every street light and intersection belonged to the man sitting next to her. As they pulled into the private underground garage of a glass and steel skyscraper, Danielle expected the police, a hospital, or perhaps a crowded lobby. Instead, the elevator opened directly into a penthouse that felt more like a fortress than a home. The space was vast and minimalist, filled with cold marble and floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the shimmering city lights. But it wasn't the luxury that caught her breath, it was the atmosphere. Two men stood at the entrance, their suits identical to Jae-sung's, their eyes scanning the hallway with a professional lethargy that Danielle recognized as extreme readiness. They didn't bow, but they stepped aside with a synchronized reverence that made her stomach tighten. As Jae-sung led her further into the living area, he finally shed his suit jacket, tossing it onto a sleek sofa. In the bright, clinical glow of the penthouse lights, Danielle saw what the mall's shadows had partially hidden. The tattoos on his chest weren't just decorative, they were a complex map of ink that disappeared under his sleeves and rose high onto his neck, a dragon's tail winding around a jagged scar she hadn't noticed before. On the mahogany desk in the corner, a row of encrypted monitors flickered with live feeds from across the city, including a direct view of the mall entrance they had just left. "You're safe here," Jae-sung said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency. He walked over to a wet bar and poured a glass of water, his movements as fluid as a cat's. "My men are at the hospital where they took Eric. He won't be speaking to anyone for a very long time." Danielle took the glass, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt through her, a mixture of gratitude and a new, sharper kind of fear. She had spent years running from a man who used his fists to feel powerful, but looking at the calculated machinery of Jae-sung's life, she realized she had been picked up by someone who didn't just use power, he was the source of it. The rumors about the Korean underworld had always felt like urban legends whispered in the break room at work, but as she watched a third man enter the room to hand Jae-sung a folder stamped with a seal she didn't recognize, the truth settled in her bones. She hadn't just been saved, she had been claimed by a man whose business was far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. Eric was a monster, but Han Jae-sung was the storm that swallowed monsters whole. The news arrived like a bucket of ice water, chilling the fragile sense of peace Danielle had managed to find within the penthouse walls. She stood in the kitchen, her fingers curled tightly around a tablet displaying a legal notification. Eric had been released. A paperwork error at the precinct, a missed signature and a failure to file the mall's surveillance footage in time, had allowed his lawyer to argue for an immediate discharge. The restraining order, the very thing that was supposed to act as a wall between her and her nightmare, had once again proven to be nothing more than a hollow promise. Her breath hitched, the familiar weight of panic settling in her chest. She could almost feel Eric's hands returning to her throat, his obsession fueled by the embarrassment of his arrest. But as the tablet slipped from her hand, a steadying presence stopped it from hitting the floor. Han Jae-sung stood behind her, his eyes scanning the screen with a terrifyingly neutral expression. He didn't look surprised or angry, he looked like a man who had expected the world to be exactly this broken. A technicality, Jae-sung murmured, the word sounding like a death sentence in his low, resonant voice. He turned Danielle toward him, his hands resting on her shoulders. The heat from his palms seeped through her clothes, grounding her. In your world, Danielle, the law is a series of rules that people hope will protect them. In my world, the law is whatever I decide it is. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. He walked to the window, looking out over the city as he made a single, brief phone call in Korean. His tone was clipped and final. When he hung up, he turned back to her, adjusting the cuffs of his white dress shirt. The dragon tattoos on his wrists seemed to pulse in the dim light. He told her to stay in the penthouse, to trust the men at the door, and to stop looking at the news. While Danielle paced the living room, Eric was experiencing a different kind of technicality. Miles away, as he walked out of the police station with a smirk of triumph, he wasn't met by a taxi or a friend. He was met by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the city noise. Two men in dark suits appeared from the shadows of an alleyway, moving with the same synchronized lethargy Danielle had seen in the penthouse. There were no shouts, no sirens, and no witnesses. Eric's smirk vanished as he realized that the legal system wasn't the only power that could track a man down. When Jae-sung returned to the penthouse hours later, there was a smudge of something dark on his collar, and his knuckles were slightly bruised, but his expression remained as calm as a still lake. He didn't mention Eric by name. He simply walked over to Danielle, took the tablet from the counter, and deleted the notification. The technicality has been resolved, he said softly, his gaze locking onto hers with a promise that went far deeper than any court order. He won't be bothering you again. Not today, and not ever. For the first time, Danielle realized that Jae-sung's brand of justice wasn't about the law, it was about permanent, unshakable protection. The evening settled over the city like a heavy velvet curtain, leaving the penthouse bathed in a soft, amber glow that felt almost out of place in a fortress. The constant hum of the monitors in the corner was muted, and for the first time, the heavy tension of the last few days seemed to thin. Danielle found Han Jae-sung in the kitchen, but he wasn't the untouchable king of the underworld she had seen at the mall. He had discarded his dress shirt for a simple black silk robe, tied loosely at the waist, and he was focused on the steam rising from a pair of delicate ceramic cups. It's a traditional tea from my home, he said, his voice barely a whisper against the silence. It's meant to settle the spirit after a storm. As he handed her the cup, the wide sleeves of his robe fell back, and Danielle froze. In the low light, the tattoos were no longer just glimpses of ink, they were a story written in skin. The dragon didn't just crawl up his arm, it coiled around a series of jagged, pale scars that marred his forearms and shoulders. These weren't just the marks of a powerful man, they were the remnants of a survivor. Danielle reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from a particularly deep mark near his wrist before she caught herself. Jae-sung didn't pull away. Instead, he looked down at the tea, his eyes reflecting a sadness that reached back years. People see the ink and they see a monster, he murmured. They think the dragon is for intimidation. But the dragon was a promise. I lived in a district in Seoul where the law didn't reach. I had a wife and a young sister. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I stayed silent enough, I could keep them in the light while I navigated the shadows. He took a slow, methodical sip of the tea, the steam obscuring his face for a moment. I was wrong. My enemies didn't care about my silence. They took them to get to me, to punish me for rising too fast. I arrived too late. The law did nothing because the men who took them were the ones who paid the precinct's salaries. He looked up at Danielle, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath hitch. That is why I don't believe in pieces of paper, Danielle. And that is why, when I saw Eric's hands on you at that mall, I didn't see a stranger. I saw the moment I failed them happening all over again. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't cold. Danielle looked from the scars to the man, realizing that his ruthlessness wasn't born of cruelty, but of a devastating, protective love. He had built an empire of shadows so that no one could ever step out of them to hurt those under his care again. As they sat together in the quiet night, the dragon's tea warming her hands, Danielle realized she wasn't just being protected by a mafia boss. She was being shielded by a man who had turned his grief into armor, and for the first time, she stopped seeing the penthouse as a cage and started seeing it as a sanctuary. The days inside the penthouse began to blur into a seamless loop of filtered air and silent luxury. Danielle stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the tiny, distant cars crawl through the city streets like beetles. Below her, life was messy, loud, and unpredictable, but it was moving. Up here, everything was static. She looked down at the silk robe Jae-sung had given her, then at the textbook for her nursing degree lying open on the marble island. She had the safety she had prayed for, but as she watched a black SUV pull into the driveway 3 stories below, she realized that safety was starting to feel like a very beautiful weight. Every time she wanted to go to the library, a silent man in a tailored suit appeared to escort her. Every time she reached for the door, the electronic lock chimed with a reminder that she was under a watch that never blinked. The hyper-independence she had developed as a survival mechanism against Eric was screaming. She didn't want a protector who acted like a jailer, no matter how much better the food was inside the cell. When Han Jae-sung returned that evening, the air in the penthouse was already thick with her unspoken frustration. He moved to the bar to pour a drink, his movements as fluid and controlled as always, but he stopped when he saw Danielle standing in the center of the room, her beige coat draped over her arm. "I'm going out," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Alone, Jae-sung." No tinted windows, no shadows in suits, and no GPS trackers. Jae-sung turned, his unreadable gaze sweeping over her. "The streets aren't safe yet, Danielle. Eric's family is still looking for a way to strike back. My men are there so you don't have to look over your shoulder." "But that's just it," Danielle stepped toward him, her defiance flaring. "If I only feel safe because you're holding the leash, then I haven't actually escaped anything. I've just traded a violent cage for a golden one. I spent years being told where I could go and who I belong to. If I can't walk to the grocery store without a detail, then I'm still a prisoner. I need to know that I can survive on my own feet, or this degree and this new life don't mean anything." The silence that followed was heavy. Jae-sung's eyes dropped to the scars on his own wrists, the remnants of the family he couldn't keep safe. For a moment, the cold mafia boss flickered, replaced by a man who was terrified of history repeating itself. He looked at her, not as a piece of property to be guarded, but as a woman who was fighting for her soul. He didn't move to stop her. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted key fob. He set it on the counter between them. "The elevator is unlocked," he said softly, his voice thick with a reluctant respect. "But Danielle, understand that my protection isn't meant to limit you. It's meant to give you the world you were promised. If you go out there alone, you carry my heart with you. Be back by dark." Danielle took the key, her fingers trembling. As she walked toward the elevator, she realized that the hardest part of her journey wasn't escaping Eric, it was learning to trust that a man could offer protection without demanding ownership. The city outside was a blurred mosaic of rain and neon as Danielle sat in a quiet corner of a local cafe, savoring her first hour of true solitude. The key fob Jae-sung had given her rested on the table like a silent vow. She was finally beginning to feel the steady rhythm of her own life again, a fragile peace that felt as delicate as the steam rising from her cup. But that peace didn't just fade, it was violently punctured. Her new phone, a device Jae-sung had assured her was untraceable, vibrated with a sharp, insistent tone. She opened the message, expecting a check-in from the penthouse. Instead, the screen filled with a grainy, handheld video. The camera was shaky, focused on the back of Danielle's head from just 10 minutes ago as she had walked across the street. Then, the camera panned down to a hand holding a familiar, rusted pocket knife, Eric's knife. His voice, a low, distorted growl, filled her earbuds. "You think a suit and a tall building can hide you? I'm the air you breathe, Danielle. I'm everywhere. The blood drained from Danielle's face, her lungs suddenly feeling as though they were filled with lead. The unthinkable had happened, the monster had found a way through the dragon's scales. She didn't have to call Jae-sung. Before the video had even finished looping, a black SUV pulled onto the curb with a screech of tires that silenced the sidewalk. Two of Jae-sung's men stepped out, their faces grim, but they didn't move toward her. They moved toward the alleyway across the street. Seconds later, Han Jae-sung himself stepped out of the vehicle. He didn't look like a businessman or a billionaire. He looked like an ancient force of nature, his coat snapping in the wind, his eyes two burning coals of focused, lethal intent. He walked straight to her, his hand reaching out to take the phone. He watched the video once, his jaw tightening so hard Danielle thought his teeth might shatter. He didn't offer words of comfort. Instead, he pulled a secondary device from his pocket, a sleek, military-grade tracker that was already pulsing with a steady red light. He made a mistake, Jae-sung whispered, and the coldness in his voice made the rainy air feel like a blizzard. He used a localized signal. He wanted you to know he was close, but he forgot that I own the towers he's using to send it. Jae-sung turned back to his lead security officer and spoke a single command in Korean. It wasn't an order to arrest, it was a directive to erase. The unthinkable retaliation had begun. While the rest of the world saw a quiet city afternoon, Jae-sung was initiating a digital and physical dragnet that would leave no stone unturned. He reached out, his thumb brushing Danielle's cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the violence radiating from his posture. I told you that you carry my heart, Danielle, he said, his gaze locking onto hers with a promise that was both terrifying and beautiful. He just tried to stop it from beating. Now, he learns what happens when the underworld stops watching and starts hunting. As he led her back to the safety of the car, Danielle realized that the hunt wasn't just about her safety anymore. It was about the dragon proving that some boundaries, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The message had been intercepted, and now, the messenger was about to face a justice that no court could ever provide. The rain continued to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, turning the city skyline into a jagged, shimmering blur. Inside, the silence was absolute, but it wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of a predator holding its breath. Danielle sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her eyes fixed on the elevator doors. Jae-sung was gone, having vanished into the night shortly after the message was intercepted, leaving her under the watch of 4 silent guards who moved like ghosts through the dim hallways. She didn't hear the breach, she felt it. A subtle vibration in the floorboards, a momentary flicker in the recessed lighting that signaled someone was tampering with the building's secondary power grid. In the shadows of the long, marble-lined hallway that led to the private entrance, 3 figures emerged. They didn't wear tailored suits or carry themselves with the discipline of Jae-sung's men. These were Eric's associates, men recruited from the city's desperate underbelly, wearing heavy jackets and gripped by a frantic, amateurish energy. They moved with the confidence of people who thought they had found a blind spot in the dragon's fortress. The lead man gestured toward the master suite, his hand hovering over the hilt of a jagged blade. They thought they were the hunters, closing in on a woman who was too terrified to fight back. But as they reached the center of the hallway, the air seemed to grow heavy. The motion sensor lights didn't flare to life as they expected. Instead, a single, low-frequency hum resonated through the walls, and the heavy steel security doors at both ends of the corridor hissed shut with a finality that made the lead man's heart skip a beat. They weren't in a hallway anymore, they were in a kill box. From the darkness at the end of the passage, a cigarette cherry glowed, illuminating the sharp, unreadable features of Han Jae-sung. He was sitting in a high-backed chair that hadn't been there minutes before, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the full, terrifying length of the dragon tattoos. He didn't stand up. He didn't have to. The men he had placed in the shadows, professional, lethal, and utterly silent, stepped forward from the recessed alcoves. The realization hit Eric's associates all at once. They hadn't bypassed the security, they had been invited in. The blind spot was a lure, a deliberate opening designed to bring the threat into a controlled space where it could be dismantled without the world ever knowing. Jae-sung took a slow drag of his cigarette, the smoke curling around his head like a crown. "You were looking for Danielle," Jae-sung said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that carried more threat than any shout. "But all you found was the end of your rope." The struggle was over before it truly began. There were no gunshots to alert the neighbors, only the sound of calculated efficiency. Danielle, watching the monitors from the safety of the reinforced kitchen, saw the figures disappear into the darkness of the service elevator, escorted by Jae-sung's shadows. She realized then that the unthinkable wasn't just Jae-sung's violence, it was his absolute control over life and death. The shadows in the hallway were gone, and as Jae-sung walked back toward her, extinguishing his cigarette, he looked less like a man and more like a god who had just finished tidying his garden. The adrenaline from the night's events had long since evaporated, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. Danielle sat at the kitchen island, staring into the dark amber depths of her tea, while Han Jae-sung stood by the window, his silhouette etched against the early morning light. The city was waking up, oblivious to the fact that 3 men had vanished from a penthouse hallway just hours before. The cost of her safety was starting to settle in her mind, not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible, dangerous weight. Jae-sung turned away from the glass, his face pale and drawn. For the first time, he looked less like an invincible king and more like a man who was walking a tightrope over a canyon. He sat down across from her, his movements slow, and laid a thick manila folder on the counter. Inside were not just photos of Eric's associates, but legal documents, intercepted police communications, and bank ledgers with names Danielle didn't recognize. "Peace in my world is never free, Danielle," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "To keep you here, to make the city's eyes look the other way while I deal with Eric, I am burning through decades of carefully built alliances. Every time I move a shadow to protect you, I leave a trail that my enemies in Seoul and the federal investigators here can follow." He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. The dragon tattoos on his wrists seemed to shift as his muscles tensed. The technicality that kept Eric in check wasn't just a lucky break. It was a favor called in from people who now expect me to owe them. In the underworld, a debt to the wrong person is a death sentence. By keeping a civilian like you in the center of my fortress, I am breaking the first rule of survival: never have a weakness that can be seen from the street. Danielle looked at the documents, her heart aching. She had spent so much time worrying about her own independence that she hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of his sacrifice. He wasn't just giving her a place to stay, he was putting his entire empire, and his life, on the line to ensure she didn't become a casualty of his history. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why risk everything for someone you barely know?" Jae-sung reached across the table, his fingers grazing hers. The touch was no longer just protective, it was a plea. "Because for the first time in 10 years, I'm not just fighting to keep a territory. I'm fighting to keep a heart beating. My world is full of people who want what I have, but you are the only one who reminds me of what I lost. The price of this peace is high, Danielle, and the walls are thinning. But I would burn every bridge I built if it meant you could walk into that graduation ceremony without fear." As the sun finally broke over the horizon, Danielle realized that Jae-sung's unthinkable power wasn't in his violence or his wealth. It was in his willingness to dismantle his own safety to build hers. The price of peace was his life's work, and he was paying it without a second thought. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom were harsh and unforgiving, reflecting off the wood-paneled walls in a way that made the air feel thin and clinical. Danielle sat at the prosecutor's table, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. This was the moment she had played out in her nightmares for years, being in the same room as Eric without a glass partition or a screen between them. When the side door opened and Eric was led in by bailiffs, the sound of his shackles hitting the floor felt like a hammer against her chest. He looked different without the hoodie, smaller, stripped of the chaotic environment he used to control. But when he turned his head and locked eyes with her, the same old malice flickered in his gaze. It was a look that said he still believed she belonged to him, even here, in a house of law. Danielle felt the familiar instinct to shrink, to lower her gaze and wait for the storm to pass. But then, she looked toward the back of the gallery. In the very last row, tucked into the deepest shadows away from the cameras and the court reporters, sat Han Jae-sung. He was a silent statue in a charcoal suit, his presence a dark anchor in the sterile room. He didn't nod or smile, he simply watched her with a steady, unblinking focus. Seeing the faint outline of the dragon tattoo peeking above his collar reminded her of the night in the kitchen, the tea, the scars, and the promise that she was no longer a victim fighting for air. When it was her time to speak, Danielle stood up. Her legs felt like lead, and her voice cracked on the first few words of her name. Eric smirked, leaning back in his chair as if he had already won. But Danielle didn't look at Eric. She looked at the man in the back row who had risked his empire to give her this chance. She drew a breath, a deep, full breath that didn't catch in her throat, and began to speak. She didn't just read a statement, she recounted every moment Eric had tried to erase her. She spoke about the mall, the restraining orders he had treated as suggestions, and the fear that had been her only constant companion. Her voice grew stronger with every sentence, vibrating with a clarity that silenced the room. Eric's smirk slowly vanished, replaced by a twitch of agitation as he realized he no longer held the leash. For the first time, she wasn't pleading for her life, she was reclaiming it. As the judge handed down a sentence that would ensure Eric wouldn't see the outside of a cell for a decade, Danielle didn't feel the rush of joy she expected. Instead, she felt a profound, quiet stillness. She turned back to the gallery one last time, but the shadow in the last row was gone. Jae-sung had vanished before the gavel hit the wood, leaving her to stand on her own feet in the light. She walked out of the courtroom not as a woman who had been saved, but as a woman who had finally found the voice to save herself. The air outside the courthouse was crisp and carried the scent of rain-washed pavement, a sharp contrast to the stagnant, heavy atmosphere of the legal battle Danielle had just won. As she stepped out onto the wide stone steps, she took a long, stabilizing breath. For the first time in years, the oxygen didn't feel like it was borrowed. The black sedan was waiting at the curb, but Han Jae-sung wasn't sitting in the shadows of the back seat this time. He was standing beside the open door, his hands in his pockets, his expression softened by a look that was dangerously close to a smile. The drive was different today. The predatory speed was gone, replaced by a leisurely pace that allowed Danielle to actually see the city she had spent so long hiding from. They didn't head back toward the fortified skyscraper that had been her sanctuary. Instead, Jae-sung directed the driver toward a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood where the sounds of the city were replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of neighbors. They stopped in front of a charming, modern townhouse with large windows and a small garden that bloomed with white lilies. Jae-sung led her to the front door, but he didn't use an encrypted key fob or wait for a security guard to clear the way. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver key, placing it in Danielle's palm. "This isn't a safe house, Danielle," he said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant frequency that always made her heart skip. "A safe house is where you hide. A home is where you live. This place is in your name. There are no cameras in the hallways, and there are no men in suits standing at the door unless you invite them." As Danielle walked through the sun-drenched rooms, she found a stack of envelopes waiting on a mahogany desk in a small, quiet study. She opened the top one and felt the air leave her lungs for a different reason. It was a receipt for her final year of nursing school, tuition, books, and clinical fees, all paid in full. Beneath it was a letter of placement at the city's top teaching hospital, far removed from the dental office where Eric had once been able to find her. Jae-sung stood in the doorway, the light catching the dragon tattoos on his neck, but he looked more like a man than a myth. "I told you that my protection wasn't meant to be a leash," he said softly. "You found your voice today. Now, you have the resources to use it. You don't owe me anything for this. It's the price I was happy to pay to see you stand in the light." Danielle looked from the tuition papers to the man who had dismantled his own world to build hers. The golden cage was gone, replaced by an open door and a life where the only thing she had to fear was the unknown, not the obsessed. She realized then that Jae-sung hadn't just given her a house or a degree, he had given her the one thing Eric had spent a lifetime trying to steal, her future. She gripped the silver key, feeling its weight, and for the first time, she wasn't just safe. She was home. The auditorium was filled with the rhythmic sound of hundreds of names being called, a steady heartbeat of achievement that echoed against the high ceilings. Danielle Thornton sat among a sea of white caps and gowns, her heart racing not with the familiar thrum of fear, but with the sheer weight of pride. When her name was finally announced, she walked across the stage with a stride that was graceful and unburdened. As she accepted her nursing diploma, she didn't look at the floor or the cameras, she looked toward the very back of the hall. There, leaning against the far wall away from the jubilant families, was Han Jae-sung. He didn't cheer or wave, but as their eyes met, he gave a single, slow nod of his head. The sunlight streaming through the high windows caught the sharp line of his jaw and the dark ink peeking from his collar, but to Danielle, he was no longer the terrifying shadow from the mall. He was the foundation upon which she had rebuilt her world. Later that afternoon, the celebrations faded into a quiet, golden sunset. Jae-sung took her to a small, private overlook that gazed out over the city, the same city where, 6 months ago, she had fought for a single breath of air on a marble floor. The wind was cool, rustling the fabric of the beige coat she still wore, but she no longer felt the need to pull it tight against a hidden threat. "You did it," Jae-sung said softly, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the city's distant hum. "You took back everything they tried to steal." "We did it," Danielle corrected, turning to face him. "You gave me the space to find my strength again." Jae-sung reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. He didn't kneel, and he didn't offer a rehearsed speech. Instead, he stepped close, his presence a warm, familiar shield. "I told you once that the dragon on my skin was a promise. I want to give you a promise of your own." He opened the box to reveal a necklace of brilliant, teardrop diamonds that shimmered like captured starlight. As he stepped behind her to fasten the clasp, his fingers were steady and warm against her skin. The weight of the stones settled exactly where the bruises from Eric's hands had once been, a deliberate, beautiful replacement of pain with light. "This isn't just a gift, Danielle," he whispered, his breath a gentle warmth against her ear. "In my world, this signifies a permanent order. It means that wherever you walk, you carry the full weight of my protection. You are no longer just a survivor. You are part of the Underworld love chapters, and I protect my family above all else." Danielle reached up, her fingers tracing the cool diamonds. She looked out at the horizon, realizing that the fear that had once defined her life had finally evaporated. She was no longer a woman running from a monster, she was a woman standing beside a king, protected by a love that was as unbreakable as the diamonds around her neck. The old world was gone, and in its place, a new order had begun. Thank you for watching and listening to this story till the end. Please don't forget to subscribe, like and comment. Turn on your notification button for more stories and check out our next story which is being shown on the screen because you wouldn't love to miss what happened there.